My ex-wife burst into my home and said, "You've been abusing my daughter during weekend visits." Behind Delilah, 2 police officers stood in my doorway, their faces carved from stone. One of them was already unclipping his handcuffs. "What?" The word came out broken. "Delilah, what are you talking about?" "Don't you dare," she hissed. "Don't you dare stand there and lie to me about hurting Yasmin." I pressed my hands against the floor to steady myself. "I would never." "Delilah, last weekend we went to the zoo. She had strawberry ice cream. It got all over her unicorn shirt and we laughed about it for 20 minutes. What is happening?" The taller officer stepped forward. "Sir, Child Protective Services has been granted emergency custody. We need you to come with us." "She fed the giraffes," I said stupidly, like that would fix everything. She named one Frederick. "Delilah, please, she fed the giraffes." But Delilah was already pulling out her phone, her hands trembling with rage. Miss Catherine documented everything. The bruises on Yasmin's arms. Yasmin told her, "Daddy hurts me." There are photos, James. Time-stamped photos showing finger marks. Catherine. The name hit me like ice water. Catherine from Tiny Steps Daycare. Catherine, who'd cornered me at pickup last Tuesday, pressed herself against me in the parking lot while Yasmin was in the bathroom, who'd whispered that she knew I was lonely after the divorce. "The daycare teacher," I breathed. "Delilah, it's the daycare teacher. The one who's been hitting on me. I told you about her last month when we were discussing pickup schedules." Delilah's laugh was bitter. "Of course you're blaming someone else. I filed a complaint with the daycare director 5 days ago. Call them. Please, just call them." But she was already walking away, the officers moving toward me. That evening, after 6 hours at the station, after my lawyer told me not to say another word, I sat in my empty house staring at my phone. The doorbell rang. Catherine stood on my porch wearing a sundress I recognized from last week's pickup, her lipstick fresh, holding a bottle of wine. "James," she said sweetly, "I heard you've had a rough day. Thought you might need some company." My throat closed. "What did you do?" She walked past me into my house like she owned it, setting the wine on my counter. "I gave your ex-wife some concerning information. Things I've noticed. Things Yasmin's been saying." Yasmin never said anything. You know she didn't. Catherine turned and her mask finally slipped. Her smile was still there, but her eyes were dead. "Oh, I know. She's such a sweet girl. So eager to please. It's amazing what kids will say when you promise them candy. She thought we were playing a game. The bruises. Theater makeup. I did community theater for years. 20 minutes during nap time, some careful photography, and voila. I even made sure to use the same bruise patterns that typically appear in abuse cases." She smiled like she was proud of herself. "You tortured my daughter to get back at me?" "Tortured?" She laughed, actually laughed. "You're the one who humiliated me. In front of the other parents, in front of my co-workers. Men like you, walking around thinking you're too good for someone like me. Acting like I'm beneath you just because I work at a daycare instead of some fancy office. I said I wasn't interested. You embarrassed me." Her voice cracked. "And now you'll lose everything. Your daughter, your reputation, any chance of getting decent custody. The other parents already know." I made sure to look properly devastated when I had to report it. They're all talking about how they missed the signs, how you seemed so normal. The front door opened. Delilah walked in with Yasmin's overnight bag to get her things, then froze when she saw Catherine. Catherine's face immediately crumpled into practiced tears. "Oh, Delilah, I'm so sorry you're going through this. I just came to drop off Yasmin's artwork from class. I think James shouldn't have any visitation at all. For Yasmin's safety." "Stop," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Delilah, ask doctor." Pete for Yasmin's camp physical records, from 2 days ago. Catherine's tears paused for just a second. "The full body exam she needed for summer camp," I continued, watching Catherine's face drain of color. "Every inch documented. No bruises, no marks, nothing. And while you're at it, ask him to check his parking garage security footage from last Tuesday at 4:30. Delilah looked between us, and I saw something shift in her expression. "The footage of Catherine following me to my car," I said. "Of her grabbing me. Of me pulling away. It's all there, every second of it. She did this." I could tell Delilah had no idea who to believe. She pulled out her phone and called the cops. The 2 officers who'd been standing behind Delilah turned toward each other, and I could see them trying to figure out what just happened. Percy, the taller one, held up his hand to Delilah and then looked at Catherine standing in my living room. He walked toward her slowly, his partner staying near me. Percy asked Catherine to step outside with him so they could talk privately. Catherine's face changed so fast it was like watching someone flip a switch. The tears stopped. Her mouth went flat. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward my front door without looking at any of us. Percy followed her out onto the porch, and through my window I watched him pull out a small notebook from his pocket. Catherine stood with her arms crossed, shaking her head at whatever Percy was saying. Her whole body looked stiff and angry now, nothing like the crying woman from 2 minutes ago. Percy's partner, a shorter guy with gray hair, pulled out his own notebook and asked me to tell him exactly what Catherine said when she came to my door tonight. I went through it all again, trying to remember her exact words about the theater makeup and the candy game and how she coached Yasmin. The officer wrote everything down, asking me to repeat certain parts. Outside, Catherine suddenly pointed at Percy's face and said something loud enough that I could hear her voice through the window, but not the words. Percy stayed calm, just kept writing in his notebook. Catherine pulled her phone out of her purse and held it up like she was going to make a call. Percy said something to her, and she put the phone away, but her hand was shaking. Delilah hadn't moved from her spot near my kitchen. She just stood there holding her phone, staring out the window at Catherine. I couldn't read her face. Was she believing me now, or was she thinking I somehow set this whole thing up? The officer finished taking my statement and went outside to talk to Percy. Through the window, I watched Catherine's mouth moving fast, her hands waving around. Then she stopped talking and her face went blank. Percy showed her something in his notebook. Catherine shook her head hard and took 3 steps toward her car. Percy moved to block her path. Catherine said something sharp and Percy responded by holding up one finger. Catherine pulled her phone out again. This time, Percy didn't stop her. She pressed it to her ear and turned her back to him. After maybe 30 seconds, she said something into the phone and hung up. Percy wrote something else in his notebook. Catherine demanded something. I could tell by how she leaned toward him. Percy shook his head. Catherine's lawyer was probably on the way. Percy made a note of that in his report, I figured. The fact that she lawyered up immediately. That's what guilty people do. Catherine walked to her car without asking permission this time. Percy let her go, but took a photo of her license plate with his phone. I watched Catherine's taillights disappear down my street. Delilah finally moved, turning away from the window to look at me. Her phone was still in her hand, but she wasn't holding it up anymore. It just hung there at her side. Her face looked different now, not angry like before, more confused and tired. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Percy came back inside with his partner. He asked me if I could come to the station tomorrow morning around 9 to give a formal statement. I said yes. Percy walked around my porch area taking photos with his phone. He took pictures of the wine bottle Catherine brought, still sitting on my counter. He photographed my front door, the porch, even the spot where Catherine had been standing. He treated my house like it was a crime scene now, which I guess it was. Percy asked if I'd touched the wine bottle. I said no. He pulled out a plastic evidence bag from his car and used a pen to push the bottle into it without touching it directly. His partner asked Delilah if she needed anything. She shook her head. Percy told me someone from the detective unit would call to schedule my formal interview. He said to write down everything I remembered from tonight while it was fresh. Then both officers left. The house got really quiet. Delilah and I just stood there in my living room, not looking at each other. The silence felt heavy and awkward. I didn't know what to say. Should I ask about Yasmin? Should I try to explain more? Should I just wait for her to talk first? Delilah finally broke the silence. She asked if I really filed a complaint about Catherine. Her voice sounded small and unsure. Nothing like the angry woman from this morning. I pulled out my phone and opened my email. I found the message from Kevin at the daycare and held the phone out to her. She took it from my hand and read the screen. The email was dated 5 days before Catherine made her CPS report. Right there in black and white, proof that I'd complained about Catherine's behavior before any of this started. Delilah's hand started shaking as she read. She read it twice, then looked up at me. She handed my phone back and then just kind of collapsed onto my couch without asking if she could sit down. She stared at the floor. She didn't say sorry or anything like that. But she did say she should have asked me more questions before believing the photos. She said she should have talked to me about what Yasmin said, instead of just assuming Catherine was telling the truth. Her voice cracked a little when she mentioned Yasmin's name. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. I pulled out my phone again and called my lawyer. It went to voicemail. I left a message explaining what happened tonight, how Catherine came here and confessed everything, how Delilah heard it, how the police came and documented it all. I said I needed to talk to him as soon as possible. Delilah was still sitting on my couch listening to every word. When I hung up, she said her lawyer should probably know about this too. She said it changes everything about the emergency custody order. She said it quietly, like she was talking more to herself than to me. That night after Delilah left, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through everything that happened. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up and went to my computer. I opened a new document and started typing. I wrote down every single interaction I ever had with Catherine. Every time she made me uncomfortable at pickup. Every time she stood too close or touched my arm. Every time she said something that felt wrong. I included dates as best as I could remember them. Times. I wrote down the names of other parents who were there during some of the incidents. Mark's dad had been there when Catherine cornered me by the Cubbies. Sarah's mom saw Catherine follow me to my car that one time in March. I kept typing until my document was 6 pages long. The sun started coming up outside my window. At 6 in the morning, I called Dr. Mittel's office. I got the answering service. I left a message asking for Yasmin's complete medical records, especially the camp physical from 2 days before CPS took her. I said it was urgent and for a legal matter. The receptionist called me back at 7:15. She said the records would be ready by noon. I could pick them up in person. I thanked her and hung up. Then I opened my email and found the message from my building management company. I hit reply and typed out a request to preserve the parking garage security footage from last Tuesday at 4:30 in the afternoon. I explained it was needed for a legal matter. I said I'd be happy to come view it in person or have my lawyer contact them. I hit send. They responded within 20 minutes saying footage was kept for 30 days and they'd flag it in their system so it wouldn't get deleted. They gave me the name and number of their security manager to coordinate viewing the footage. I set my alarm for 7:30, but I was already awake when it went off. My phone rang at exactly 8 in the morning, and Christopher's name showed up on the screen. I answered before the second ring, and he asked me to walk him through everything that happened last night in detail. I told him about Catherine showing up with wine, about her confession, about the theater makeup and manipulating Yasmin during nap time, about Delilah hearing everything, about the police coming and documenting it all. He listened without interrupting once, and when I finished, he said this was exactly what we needed. He said Catherine's admission combined with the medical records and the security footage could get the emergency custody order reversed, but we had to move fast. He said to document everything while it was fresh in my mind and gather every piece of evidence we could find. He said he'd start drafting an emergency motion to file with family court as soon as possible. 20 minutes after I hung up with Christopher, my phone rang again, and this time it was a number I didn't recognize. A woman introduced herself as Maeve O'Leary from CPS and asked if I could schedule a home inspection and interview for later this week. Her voice was professional but not cold or hostile like I expected. She said new information had come to light that required follow-up investigation, and she wanted to see my home environment and talk to me about the allegations. I agreed to Thursday afternoon, and she said she'd email me the details. After the call ended, I realized I was shaking, and I had to sit down on my couch for a minute. I couldn't just sit there doing nothing, so I grabbed my keys and drove to Dr. Mittel's office to pick up Yasmin's records in person. I needed to do something productive with all this nervous energy burning through me. The medical building was quiet when I walked in, and the receptionist recognized me from previous visits with Yasmin. She handed me a sealed manila envelope and said, "Doctor." Mittal had prepared everything I requested. She mentioned that the doctor had specifically noted in her records that the camp physical exam showed no signs of injury or abuse anywhere on Yasmin's body. She said it quietly like she knew why I needed the documentation, and I thanked her and left before my voice could crack. I drove straight to Christopher's office downtown in a small brick building near the courthouse. His paralegal Yvonne greeted me at the front desk with a warm smile, despite clearly knowing why I was there. She showed me to Christopher's office, and he immediately opened the sealed envelope and started reading through the medical records page by page. He nodded as he read, and then looked up and said this documentation was exactly what we needed to challenge Catherine's fabricated photos. He pointed to the body diagram that showed 0 marks except for one small birthmark on Yasmin's shoulder, and he said this proved the bruises in Catherine's photos couldn't have been real. I sat in the chair across from his desk, feeling like I could finally breathe a little bit. Before I left his office, I pulled out my phone and called Kevin at the daycare. He answered on the 3rd ring and sounded uncomfortable when I told him who it was. I asked him to confirm in writing that he received my complaint about Catherine's inappropriate behavior, and to send me a copy of the complaint form I filled out with the date it was filed. He was quiet for a few seconds, and then he said he could do that. He said he'd email me a copy today along with the date it was submitted to the daycare board. He sounded relieved to get off the phone, and I didn't blame him. I was walking back to my car when my phone rang again, and this time it was someone from HR at my job. My stomach twisted into a knot when she asked me to come in for a meeting tomorrow morning about some allegations that had been reported to them. She wouldn't give me details over the phone, but I knew exactly what had happened. Catherine, or someone she told, had contacted my workplace to spread the abuse accusations, and now my job was involved too. I told her I'd be there tomorrow and hung up feeling sick. I drove home and spent the rest of the morning organizing all my documentation into folders on my computer and printing copies of everything. Around 2 in the afternoon, my doorbell rang, and Maeve stood on my porch holding a tablet and a leather folder. She was younger than I expected, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she shook my hand firmly when I let her inside. I showed her around the house room by room, and she took notes on her tablet without saying much. She looked at Yasmin's bedroom with all her toys and books, and the unicorn bedspread she picked out herself. She asked me to explain my timeline of events from the beginning, so I walked her through everything starting with Catherine's behavior at pickup and ending with last night's confession. She asked detailed questions about Catherine's advances and my prior complaint to the daycare, and she wrote down every answer I gave her. Her face didn't show what she was thinking, but at least she was listening. While Maeve was still there, my phone buzzed with a call from the building security manager. I excused myself and answered it in the kitchen, and he told me the parking garage footage from last Tuesday existed and was preserved in their system. He said he could schedule a time for me and the police to review it together whenever we were ready. I thanked him and immediately texted Percy to coordinate a time, and I felt like each piece of evidence was one more step closer to getting Yasmin back. After Maeve left, I called Christopher again, and he explained that we were dealing with 3 separate processes running at the same time. He said there was the CPS investigation, the family court custody proceedings, and a potential criminal case against Catherine for false reporting. He pulled up a calendar and mapped out timelines and requirements for each process and showed me what needed to happen when. I felt overwhelmed looking at all the dates and deadlines, but I was grateful for how organized he was about everything. He said we'd get through this one step at a time, and I wanted to believe him. Right before 5 in the evening, Kevin's email came through with a PDF attachment. I opened it, and there was my written complaint with the timestamp clearly visible showing I filed it 5 days before Catherine made her report to CPS. Kevin added a note at the bottom saying the daycare board was conducting an internal review of Catherine's conduct and employment status, and they'd keep me updated on the outcome. I forwarded the email to Christopher immediately, and then I printed 3 copies and added them to my evidence folders. The next morning, I drove to my office building with my stomach in knots. The HR representative met me in a small conference room on the 3rd floor, instead of my usual workspace. She was someone I'd seen around but never really talked to before. She sat across from me with a folder and explained that an anonymous report had been filed claiming I was under investigation for child abuse. Her voice was professional, but I could see the discomfort in how she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. She said the company had to place me on paid administrative leave until the CPS case was resolved. I nodded and tried to keep my face neutral, even though I felt like everyone could see right through me. When I walked back through the office to get my things from my desk, I saw coworkers glancing at me and then quickly looking away. 2 people from my team were standing by the coffee machine, and they stopped talking the second I walked past. I grabbed my laptop and my phone charger and left without saying goodbye to anyone. The whole thing took maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a while before I could make myself drive home. My phone rang while I was still sitting there, and it was Maeve calling to schedule something. She told me that CPS was setting up a forensic interview with Yasmin at a child advocacy center. I asked if I could be there, and she said no. That was standard protocol for these situations. She explained that a specially trained professional would conduct the interview, and it would be recorded. The interviewer knew how to identify when kids had been coached to say certain things. I thanked her and hung up and sat there feeling completely powerless. When I got home, I opened my laptop to distract myself and found an email from someone I barely knew. It had screenshots attached from a private Facebook group for parents at the daycare. I clicked through them and felt sick. The posts were all about Catherine's report, and parents were discussing whether I was dangerous. My name wasn't mentioned directly, but the details were specific enough that anyone who knew me would recognize it immediately. One parent wrote that they always thought something seemed off about me. Another said they were glad their kid wasn't in Yasmin's class anymore. I closed my laptop and walked away from it. My phone buzzed an hour later with a text from Percy asking me to come to the station tomorrow afternoon to give my formal statement. He wrote that they were treating Catherine's confession as the start of a false reporting investigation. He asked me to bring copies of all my documentation and evidence. I texted back confirming the time, and then I called Christopher to let him know. He said this was good progress and that we needed to get my statement on record as soon as possible. The next morning, I drove to Christopher's office and spent 3 hours drafting a detailed sworn statement about what happened on my porch with Catherine. I wrote down everything she said about the theater makeup and manipulating Yasmin during nap time. I included her admission about promising Yasmin candy and making her think it was a game. Yvonne sat with me and helped organize everything in chronological order. She asked questions to make sure I included every detail I could remember. She was patient when I had to stop and think about exact wording. By the time we finished, my hand hurt from signing and initialing so many pages. Christopher reviewed the whole thing and made a few small changes to make the language more precise. He said this statement would be crucial for both the police investigation and the family court case. The following afternoon, I met Percy at my building's security office. The security manager pulled up the parking garage footage from last Tuesday at 4:30 in the afternoon. We watched it on a monitor in his small office. There I was walking to my car after work. Then Catherine appeared from behind a concrete pillar and followed me. The footage showed her catching up to me and pressing herself against me while I was unlocking my door. I stepped back and held up both hands in a clear gesture of rejection. She grabbed my arm when I tried to get in my car. The timestamp at the bottom of the screen matched exactly what I'd told the police. Percy took notes and asked the security manager to make him a copy of the footage. He said this video evidence was solid proof of unwanted physical contact and my clear attempt to create distance. 2 days later, an email arrived from Dr. Mittal's office with Yasmin's complete medical file attached. I opened it and found detailed notes from her camp physical exam. There was a body diagram showing a front and back outline of a child's body. The doctor had marked 0 bruises or injuries anywhere. The form explained that overnight camp required documentation of any existing marks before kids could attend. The entire diagram was blank, except for one notation about a small birthmark on Yasmin's right shoulder. I forwarded the email to Christopher immediately, and he called me within 10 minutes. He said this medical documentation completely contradicted Catherine's fabricated photos. He was already drafting an emergency motion to modify the custody order based on all the new evidence. He also planned to request that the family court judge issue an order preventing people from posting about the case on social media. He explained we couldn't stop people from talking, but we could create legal consequences if they ignored a court order. I felt a small spark of hope for the first time in days. Percy called later that week to tell me he'd interviewed Kevin about my complaint and Catherine's behavior at the daycare. Christopher sent an email reminding me that patience was critical right now and that we were building a strong case. I knew he was right, but knowing didn't help when I lay awake at 3 in the morning, wondering if Yasmin thought I abandoned her. The forensic interview was scheduled for Thursday morning at a child advocacy center across town. I drove there 2 hours early and parked in the lot, watching other cars arrive and families walk inside. I knew Yasmin was in there somewhere, probably scared and confused about why she had to talk to strangers about her daddy. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I imagined her sitting in some sterile room with toys that were supposed to make her comfortable, while adults asked careful questions about things she didn't understand. The urge to walk inside and demand to see her was so strong I had to lock my car doors to keep myself from doing something stupid. 2 hours passed with me sitting there like an idiot, watching the building entrance and checking the time on my phone. When Delilah's car finally pulled out of the parking lot, I slumped back in my seat and tried to breathe normally. Percy called me that afternoon while I was staring at my living room wall. He said he'd interviewed Catherine at her apartment with her lawyer present. She denied everything she'd admitted on my porch. She claimed I fabricated the entire conversation and that Delilah must have misunderstood what she heard. Percy's voice was calm, but I could hear the frustration underneath. He noted that Catherine's story kept changing in small ways, little details that didn't line up between her written statement and what she said in person. He was documenting all the inconsistencies. Christopher called the next morning to tell me he was filing a subpoena for the metadata from Catherine's photos. He explained that digital photos contain hidden information about camera settings, timestamps, and sometimes GPS coordinates. The data could prove when and where the photos were actually taken and whether they'd been edited. He walked me through how metadata worked, how it was embedded in the file itself, and difficult to fake. I didn't understand all the technical details, but I trusted him. He said we'd send the files to a forensic expert once we got them. 3 days later, Maeve contacted Christopher about a supervised visitation plan. She proposed 1 hour per week at a family visitation center where a trained supervisor would watch our interaction. Christopher called to tell me about it, and I felt my chest tighten. 1 hour per week. That was all they were offering. But Christopher said it was actually a positive sign that CPS was willing to allow any contact at all. He reminded me that some parents in these situations got zero access for months. I agreed to the plan because what choice did I have? The visitation center was in a converted office building with beige walls and uncomfortable furniture. A woman with a clipboard checked me in and explained the rules. No physical contact beyond brief hugs, no discussion of the case, no questioning Yasmin about what happened. She led me to a small room with a table, some blocks, and a bin of worn-out toys. Yasmin walked in holding Delilah's hand, and my heart cracked open. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile. Her eyes went wide when she saw me, and she glanced up at Delilah like she needed permission. Delilah nodded and left without looking at me. The supervisor sat in the corner with her clipboard, while Yasmin and I stared at each other. I knelt down and opened my arms, and she ran to me. We hugged for maybe 10 seconds before the supervisor cleared her throat, and I had to let go. We sat at the table and played with blocks, building towers and knocking them down. Yasmin was quieter than usual, more careful with her words. She kept glancing at the supervisor like she was worried about saying something wrong. About halfway through our hour, she started talking about daycare and mentioned the candy game Miss Catherine taught her. She described it so innocently, explaining how Miss Catherine said if she stayed very still and let her put special stickers on her skin, she'd get candy after nap time. My stomach turned, but I kept my face neutral and just nodded. I couldn't let her see how angry and sick I felt. After the visit ended and Delilah came to pick Yasmin up, I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to pull myself together. I called Christopher and asked him to help me find a child therapist for Yasmin, who specialized in helping kids process manipulation and coaching. He said he'd send me some names and mentioned Juliet Lockhart, who had experience with cases involving false allegations. 2 days later, my workplace HR department sent an official letter switching my leave status from paid to unpaid after 2 weeks. The letter was professional and neutral, but it felt like another punch. I opened my banking app and started calculating how long I could survive on savings. I canceled my streaming subscriptions, paused my gym membership, and set up a bare-bones budget that covered only rent, utilities, and food. The numbers were tight but manageable if this didn't drag on for more than a few months. Kevin called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and his voice sounded lighter than the last time we talked. He told me the daycare board had officially suspended Catherine pending the outcome of the investigation. Parents were being notified that she was no longer with the facility. He sounded relieved, like he'd been waiting for permission to take action against her. He apologized again for not doing more when I first filed my complaint. Percy called later that week with more information. He'd contacted community theaters in the area and confirmed that Catherine performed in 3 productions over the past 2 years. The makeup artist from one show remembered teaching Catherine techniques for creating realistic bruises for a domestic violence awareness play. Percy said he documented this in his report as evidence of her capability to fabricate the photos. Every piece of evidence felt like a small step forward, but the process was so slow, I wanted to scream. Maeve scheduled her follow-up home inspection for Thursday afternoon, giving me 3 days to make sure everything looked right. I cleaned the house top to bottom, organized Yasmin's room so her toys were visible but not messy, and made sure the kitchen had healthy food in the fridge and nothing questionable in the cabinets. When Maeve arrived, she walked through each room with her clipboard, taking notes about the smoke detectors, the locked cabinet where I kept cleaning supplies, and the child-safe outlet covers I'd installed after the divorce. She spent extra time in Yasmin's room, looking at the drawings on her wall, the books on her shelf, and the photos I'd framed of us at the zoo and the park. Maeve asked me to describe our typical routine when Yasmin stayed with me, and I walked her through breakfast, playtime, the park visits, and our bedtime story ritual. She wrote everything down without showing any reaction. The next part was harder because Maeve observed my supervised visit with Yasmin at the family center. I could feel her watching us from the corner, while Yasmin and I built a tower with blocks and played a matching game with animal cards. Yasmin seemed more relaxed than last time, laughing when I made silly voices for the animals and climbing into my lap to show me a picture she'd drawn at the school. Maeve took notes the entire time, and when the hour ended, she thanked me and said she'd include her observations in her report. I wanted to ask what she thought, but Christopher had warned me not to push for information during the investigation process. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived at Christopher's office containing the subpoenaed photos Catherine had given to CPS. Christopher called me immediately and asked me to come in so we could review them together before sending them to the forensics expert. I drove to his office and found him spreading the photos across his conference table. There were 12 images total, all showing what looked like bruises on a child's arms in various positions. The marks looked convincing, exactly like finger-shaped bruises from someone grabbing too hard. Christopher pointed out details I hadn't noticed, like how the lighting seemed off in some photos and how the background didn't quite match the layout of the daycare's nap room. He pulled out his phone and took pictures of each photo, then packaged everything back up. He told me he was sending the originals to Ruben Lockhart, a digital forensics expert who analyzed images for legal cases and had testified in court dozens of times. Ruben's office was 2 hours away, but Christopher said he was worth the drive and the expense. Ruben called Christopher that afternoon and said he'd need at least 4 days to examine the metadata and image properties for signs of manipulation. Christopher explained that metadata was like a digital fingerprint, showing when and where a photo was taken, what device was used, and whether it had been edited. If Catherine had made mistakes during her fabrication, Ruben would find them. Percy called me on Monday morning and asked if I could come to the police station on Wednesday at 2 p.m. for a formal review of the parking garage footage. He said Delilah's lawyer would be there, along with someone from the prosecutor's office, and they'd all watch the footage together. I asked Christopher to come with me and he cleared his afternoon schedule. Wednesday felt like it took forever to arrive. I couldn't eat breakfast that morning and kept checking the clock every 10 minutes. Christopher met me in the police station lobby at 1:45 p.m., and we walked upstairs to a conference room where Percy was setting up a laptop connected to a large monitor. Delilah's lawyer arrived a few minutes later, a woman in a gray suit who didn't make eye contact with me. The prosecutor showed up last, a tired-looking man carrying a coffee cup and a legal pad. Percy started the footage at 4:25 p.m. on the date I'd filed my complaint. The camera angle showed the area near my car, and I watched myself walk into frame carrying my work bag. About 30 seconds later, Catherine appeared, walking fast like she was trying to catch up. The footage had no sound, but you could see her calling my name because I turned around. She approached me and started talking, moving closer than normal conversation distance. I stepped back. She moved forward again and put her hand on my arm. I pulled away and held up both hands like I was telling her to stop. She grabbed my arm with both hands when I turned toward my car. I physically removed her hands and got into my car quickly, and she stood there watching me drive away. The timestamp in the corner showed 4:28 p.m., exactly matching my complaint filing time. Percy paused the video and asked if anyone had questions. The prosecutor wrote something on his legal pad. Delilah's lawyer asked to see it again, and Percy replayed the whole sequence. This time, I noticed Catherine's body language, how aggressive she was, how she kept invading my space even when I clearly tried to create distance. Ruben's forensic report arrived on Friday afternoon in a detailed PDF that Christopher forwarded to me immediately. I opened it on my laptop and started reading, not understanding half the technical language at first. Christopher called me 20 minutes later to explain what it meant. The photo metadata showed the images were taken at times when Yasmin wasn't even at daycare, according to the sign-in logs Christopher had subpoenaed. 3 photos were taken at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, when Yasmin had a doctor's appointment and left daycare at 1:30 p.m. 2 more were taken at 8:45 a.m. on a Thursday before drop-off time. The lighting analysis showed the photos were taken in a room with different window placement than the daycare nap room. Most damaging of all, the EXIF data indicated the photos were edited using makeup application software, the kind people use to add digital cosmetics to selfies. Ruben's report included screenshots showing the editing layers and the specific tools Catherine had used to enhance and adjust the fake bruises. Christopher's voice sounded excited when he told me this was exactly the evidence we needed to destroy Catherine's credibility. He said he'd send copies to Percy, to Maeve, and to the family court judge handling our custody case. Monday morning, Christopher called me with frustration in his voice. Delilah's lawyer had contacted him about reaching a settlement where I would accept ongoing supervised visitation only, essentially giving up on returning to our previous custody arrangement. The proposal suggested I could see Yasmin twice a week for 2 hours each time, always with a supervisor present, and we'd revisit the arrangement in 6 months. Christopher asked how I felt about it, and I told him I was furious. I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't accepting a deal that treated me like an actual abuser just because Catherine was good at lying. Christopher told me he agreed completely, but he wanted to make sure I understood the risks of rejecting the settlement. If we went to a full hearing and somehow lost, I might end up with less than what they were offering now. I asked him if he really thought we'd lose with all the evidence we had. He said no, the evidence was strong, but family court could be unpredictable sometimes. I told him to reject the settlement and let the evidence speak for itself. Christopher said he'd call Delilah's lawyer back and make it clear we weren't interested in any deal that restricted my custody rights. That Wednesday, I took Yasmin to her therapy session with Juliet Lockhart. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and a fish tank that Yasmin liked to watch before her appointments. Juliet came out to get Yasmin and gave me a small smile before leading her back to the therapy room. I sat in the waiting room reading news on my phone for 45 minutes until Juliet opened her door and gestured for me to come back. She did this sometimes after sessions, giving me updates on Yasmin's progress without breaking confidentiality. Juliet showed me a drawing Yasmin had made during their session. It showed stick figures at a table with the word daycare written at the top in Yasmin's careful printing. One figure was labeled me, and another was labeled Miss Catherine. Yasmin had drawn small circles on the me figure's arms. Juliet explained that she'd asked Yasmin about the circles without leading the question, and Yasmin described them as stickers that Miss Catherine put on her skin during nap time. Yasmin said it was a game where she had to stay very still and close her eyes, and if she was good, she got candy afterward. Juliet had documented everything carefully, writing down Yasmin's exact words and noting that the child described the experience as a game, not as something scary or painful. Juliet said this kind of testimony from a child, given without coaching or leading questions, could be important for the legal case. She made a copy of the drawing and her notes for Christopher. The next day, Christopher called me with news from Maeve. She'd told him privately that the evidence was shifting the CPS assessment in a big way, and their investigation was moving toward an unfounded finding. But Maeve had also given him a warning to pass along to me. She said some parents from the daycare were trying to bait me into responding to their online posts about the case. There were comments on the parent Facebook group, and some public posts on community pages suggesting I was dangerous and questioning why I wasn't in jail yet. Maeve advised me to avoid any social media engagement or public statements about the case. She explained that anything I said, even defending myself, could be taken out of context and used against me in court. Christopher agreed completely and told me to stay off all social media until the case was resolved. He said the evidence would speak for itself, and I didn't need to defend my reputation to people who'd already made up their minds. I promised I wouldn't respond to anything online, even though it made me angry knowing people were spreading lies about me, and I couldn't say anything back. Christopher called me again on Friday with an update about Percy's investigation. Percy had interviewed Delilah with all the new evidence laid out in front of her, including the forensic report, the parking garage footage, and Yasmin's therapy notes. According to Christopher, who'd spoken with Delilah's lawyer afterward, she was starting to show cracks in her certainty about Catherine's allegations. She wasn't ready to admit she'd been completely wrong, but she was no longer insisting that Catherine's story must be true. Delilah's lawyer had apparently advised her that the evidence was strong enough to reverse the emergency custody order, and continuing to fight against my visitation rights might backfire in family court. Christopher said this was a good sign that Delilah was finally seeing the truth, even if her pride wouldn't let her apologize yet. He reminded me to stay patient and let the legal process work, which was harder than it sounded when I just wanted my daughter back full-time. That weekend, I started receiving text messages from a phone number I didn't recognize. The first one came Saturday morning while I was making coffee. It called me a child abuser and said I deserved to rot in prison. I deleted it and tried to ignore it, but 3 more messages came over the next few hours. They got worse, threatening that I'd never see Yasmin again and that everyone knew what I really was. One message said Catherine was a hero for exposing me. I took screenshots of every message and called Christopher even though it was Saturday. He told me to save every single message and forward them all to Percy immediately. He said threatening messages could be traced back to their source, and if Catherine was behind them, it would add harassment charges to her growing legal problems. Christopher explained that burner phones could be tracked through purchase records and activation data, and the police had ways of figuring out who bought them. I forwarded all the screenshots to Percy with a brief email explaining when I'd received them. Percy responded within an hour saying he'd start the process of tracing the phone's origin and asked me to keep forwarding any new messages I received. Monday morning, the local news website posted a statement from the daycare board. I saw it when my neighbor texted me a link with the message, "Finally." The statement said the board was cooperating fully with law enforcement and CPS, and they were implementing additional training on professional boundaries and mandatory reporting procedures. They mentioned reviewing their hiring practices and background check policies to ensure the safety of all children in their care. The statement didn't mention Catherine by name, but everyone who'd been following the situation knew exactly who they were talking about. The comments section filled up quickly with parents expressing shock and anger, though some people defended Catherine and said the investigation was probably a misunderstanding. I closed the browser and didn't read any more comments, remembering Maeve's advice about staying away from social media. Christopher called me that afternoon and said the public statement was actually good for our case because it showed the daycare was taking the situation seriously and admitting there had been problems with staff conduct. He said it would be harder for anyone to argue that my complaints about Catherine were made up when the daycare itself was acknowledging issues and making policy changes. 2 days later, Christopher called to say Maeve had filed her recommendation with family court. He read parts of it to me over the phone, her professional language stating that the evidence did not support abuse findings and recommending my visitation increase to unsupervised day visits. I sat at my kitchen table holding the phone, trying to process what this meant. Christopher warned me not to celebrate yet because Delilah's lawyer could still contest the recommendation, and we had the full hearing coming up in 3 weeks. He said this was progress but not victory, and I needed to stay focused on preparation. I thanked him and hung up, then stared at the wall for 20 minutes. The pre-hearing conference happened the following Wednesday, in a small room at the courthouse. Delilah sat on one side with her lawyer, a woman in a gray suit who kept shuffling papers. Christopher and I sat across from them, and the judge reviewed documents at the head of the table. Delilah's lawyer argued that Rubin's metadata analysis was unreliable because digital evidence could be manipulated or misinterpreted. She said photo data wasn't concrete proof, and that expert witnesses often disagreed about technical findings. Christopher stayed calm and presented Rubin's credentials, listing his years of experience and court testimony history. He handed over the detailed technical report with charts and timestamps that showed exactly how the photos were altered. The judge read through several pages, her expression neutral. She asked Delilah's lawyer specific questions about which parts of the analysis she disputed. The lawyer gave vague answers about general reliability concerns. The judge made notes and said Ruben would testify at the full hearing, so both sides could question his methods directly. Christopher squeezed my arm under the table. That afternoon, Percy called with news about the burner phone. He explained that his team traced the purchase to a store 3 blocks from Catherine's apartment building. The phone was activated using an IP address that matched her building's network. Percy said he couldn't prove Catherine personally sent the threatening messages because anyone in her building could theoretically access that network. But the circumstantial evidence was strong enough to include in his investigation report. He asked if I'd received any more messages. I told him nothing new in the past week. Percy said that was good, and probably meant Catherine realized the messages could be traced. The hearing date arrived on a cold morning in late October. I wore the suit Christopher told me to buy, dark blue with a tie that didn't feel like it was choking me. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that hummed. Delilah sat with her lawyer on the left side. I sat with Christopher on the right. The judge entered and everyone stood. Maeve was called first to testify. She walked to the witness stand in professional clothes carrying a folder. The court clerk swore her in. Delilah's lawyer questioned her first, asking about standard CPS procedures and investigation timelines. Maeve answered each question precisely, explaining how she conducted home inspections and interviewed witnesses. She described visiting my house twice and observing my interactions with Yasmin during supervised visits. Christopher stood for his turn and asked Maeve directly whether the evidence supported abuse findings. Maeve stated clearly that it did not. She said my home environment was safe and appropriate. My relationship with Yasmin appeared loving and healthy, and the medical records contradicted the abuse allegations. She mentioned the clean camp physical exam and the absence of any injuries during her observations. Delilah's lawyer tried to challenge this during redirect, suggesting that abuse could be hidden or intermittent. Maeve responded that all the evidence pointed away from abuse rather than toward it. Ruben took the stand next. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt, looking more like a teacher than a tech expert. Christopher asked him to explain his analysis in simple terms. Ruben described how digital photos contain hidden data about when and where they were taken, what camera settings were used, and whether they were edited. He walked through the metadata from Catherine's photos step by step. The timestamps showed the images were captured during times when Yasmin wasn't at daycare, according to the sign-in logs. The lighting angles didn't match the nap room layout based on window positions. The EXIF data revealed the photos were opened in editing software, typically used for makeup application and special effects. Ruben showed in large sections of the photos where the bruise edges had slightly different color values than surrounding skin, indicating layered editing. Delilah's lawyer questioned his methods, asking whether metadata could be wrong or corrupted. Ruben explained the multiple verification steps he used and the consistency of findings across different analysis tools. He said the probability of all these inconsistencies occurring naturally was extremely low. The judge asked him technical questions about his process, and Ruben answered each one thoroughly. Christopher played the parking garage security footage on a screen set up in the courtroom. Everyone watched Catherine follow me to my car. She moved close and put her hand on my chest. I stepped back and held up both hands. She grabbed my arm when I turned to leave. I pulled away and walked quickly toward the stairwell. The timestamp in the corner showed the date and time, matching exactly when I filed my complaint with the daycare. The footage had no sound, but the actions were clear. Catherine initiated every contact. I rejected every advance. Delilah's lawyer had no questions about the footage. Delilah testified after lunch. She sat in the witness stand looking tired, her hands folded in her lap. Her lawyer asked her to explain why she believed Catherine's report initially. Delilah said the photos looked convincing, and Yasmin had repeated the coached statements about Daddy hurting her. She admitted she acted quickly without investigating further because she was scared for Yasmin's safety. She mentioned pressure from other daycare parents who were talking about the allegations. Delilah said she was influenced by her own fears about custody and her anger at me from the divorce. Christopher asked her during cross-examination whether she had contacted Dr. Mittal to verify the medical records before calling CPS. Delilah said no. He asked whether she had viewed the parking garage footage before filing for emergency custody. She said she didn't know it existed. Christopher asked if she had spoken to the daycare director about my complaint. Delilah admitted she hadn't done that either. She said she should have asked me more questions and investigated the situation before taking action. Her voice cracked slightly when she said this, but she didn't cry. I took the stand last, my hands sweating despite the cold courtroom. Christopher walked me through the timeline we had practiced. I explained the zoo trip with Yasmin the weekend before CPS took her, describing the giraffes and the strawberry ice cream. I talked about Catherine's behavior at pickup, how she made me uncomfortable, how I tried to set boundaries politely. I described filing the complaint with the daycare director 5 days before Catherine made her report. Christopher showed me photos from the zoo trip on his tablet, and I identified Yasmin in her unicorn shirt feeding the giraffes. I explained the camp physical exam and how Dr. Mittal documented Yasmin's body thoroughly with no marks or bruises. Delilah's lawyer asked me whether I ever lost my temper with Yasmin. I said no. She asked whether I ever used physical discipline. I said no. She asked whether I understood why Delilah believed Catherine's allegations. I said I understood she was scared, but I wished she had talked to me first. I kept my voice steady, and my answers short like Christopher taught me. The judge reviewed documents for several minutes after I stepped down. The courtroom was silent except for papers rustling and the hum of the lights. She finally looked up and said she had serious concerns about fabrication and harassment by Catherine. She noted that the cumulative evidence strongly suggested the abuse allegations were manufactured rather than real. She questioned why CPS acted so quickly on uncorroborated claims without verifying the medical records or investigating the timeline. She said the parking garage footage combined with the complaint filing date established clear retaliation motive. She mentioned Rubin's analysis and the impossibility of the photo timestamps matching actual daycare attendance. The judge stated that protecting children were paramount, but false allegations damaged families and wasted resources that should go to real abuse cases. She looked directly at me and then at Delilah before announcing her ruling. The CPS case was reclassified as unfounded, meaning no abuse occurred. Custody would shift to a structured 50-50 arrangement with both parents attending co-parenting therapy for 6 months. A protective order was issued barring Catherine from any contact with me, Yasmin, or Delilah. The judge said the order would remain in effect for 3 years, and any violation would result in immediate arrest. She scheduled a follow-up hearing in 90 days to review the co-parenting progress. My legs felt weak when I stood up. Christopher squeezed my shoulder and said something I didn't hear through the rushing sound in my ears. Delilah walked past without looking at me. I sat back down because I wasn't sure I could make it to the door yet. Christopher drove me home because I didn't trust myself behind the wheel. My hands kept shaking every time I thought about what the judge said. Percy called that evening while I was sitting on my couch staring at nothing. He told me the prosecutor's office would pursue misdemeanor charges against Catherine for false reporting and harassment. I asked what that meant for punishment. Percy explained they were offering a diversion program that would keep Catherine out of jail if she completed counseling and probation. I felt my jaw tighten. That was it? After everything she did to Yasmin, to me, to our family? Percy's voice was patient when he explained that proving criminal intent in false reporting cases was really difficult. The prosecutor had to show Catherine knew the allegations were false when she made them, not just that she was mad at me. The diversion program was actually a decent outcome given how hard these cases were to win. I thanked him and hung up, but I sat there feeling like the justice system had let us down. 2 days later, an envelope arrived from Tiny Steps Daycare with the board's official letterhead. The letter explained that Catherine's employment had been terminated effective immediately. They were implementing new policies about reporting procedures and professional boundaries for all staff members. The letter went to every parent whose kid attended the daycare. My phone rang that afternoon and Kevin's name appeared on the screen. I almost didn't answer. Kevin's voice was tight when he apologized for not acting sooner on my complaint. He said he should have taken my concerns more seriously instead of just documenting them and watching to see if anything else happened. He sounded genuinely sorry, but it didn't change the fact that Catherine had access to Yasmin for almost a week after I reported her behavior. The first co-parenting therapy session with Delilah happened the following Tuesday at a small office across town. We sat in uncomfortable chairs facing a therapist neither of us had met before. Delilah picked at her nails and wouldn't look at me for the first 10 minutes. The therapist asked us to each share our perspective on what happened. I kept my explanation short and factual. Delilah's voice cracked when she admitted she should have believed me from the start. She said she was sorry for not asking more questions before taking Yasmin away. The apology felt genuine, even though it couldn't undo the damage. We spent the rest of the hour setting up communication rules using a co-parenting app the therapist recommended. No phone calls unless it was an emergency. All schedule changes and updates about Yasmin would go through the app where everything was documented. We both agreed to put Yasmin's needs first, even though the trust between us was broken. Yasmin started seeing Juliet twice a week at a child therapy office decorated with toys and bright colors. I attended parent consultations where Juliet taught me how to talk to Yasmin about what happened without making her feel responsible for any of it. Juliet explained that kids were tough and could bounce back from difficult situations, but they needed grown-ups to help them understand that the games Catherine played weren't okay. She showed me how to validate Yasmin's feelings without asking leading questions. I practiced phrases like, "That must have been confusing," and "It's not your fault," until they felt natural. Juliet said Yasmin was processing everything through play and art, which was normal for her age. The HR meeting at my workplace happened on a Thursday morning. My direct supervisor sat in the room looking uncomfortable while the HR representative read from a prepared statement. The allegations had been investigated and found to be without merit. I was reinstated immediately with full pay for the time I was on leave. My supervisor shook my hand and said he was glad everything got cleared up. I walked back to my desk and could feel eyes on me from co-workers who had heard the rumors. Some people smiled and welcomed me back. Others looked away quickly when I made eye contact. I knew they were wondering what really happened, whether the investigation actually cleared me, or if I just got away with something. The awkwardness followed me to the break room and sat heavy during team meetings. The family court judge sent both Delilah and me a formal order requiring us to complete a parenting class and continue individual therapy for 6 months. I read the order twice, feeling frustrated about more requirements being added to my schedule. But I also recognized that we both needed help figuring out how to co-parent after everything that happened. The class met every Wednesday evening for 8 weeks. Delilah and I sat on opposite sides of the room and barely spoke to each other outside of the required group discussions. Christopher called to tell me that Catherine accepted the diversion program. She would be on probation for 18 months, attend mandatory counseling sessions, and accept a permanent restriction preventing her from working in any job involving contact with children. I asked if that was really enough. Christopher reminded me that Catherine's career was basically over, and she would have a permanent record showing what she did. Any background check would show the false reporting case. She wouldn't be able to work at daycares, schools, camps, or anywhere else that hired people to be around kids. It wasn't the punishment I wanted, but it was something. My first normal weekend with Yasmin felt like a small miracle. She showed up Friday evening with her overnight bag and her favorite stuffed giraffe. Saturday morning, we made pancakes together in the kitchen, and she stood on a stool to help me flip them. We talked about our zoo trip and Frederick the giraffe while we ate. Yasmin asked if we could go back to the zoo soon. She announced that Frederick's name was actually Freddy now, because it sounded friendlier. She spent an hour drawing pictures of our next zoo visit, including Freddy eating leaves from her hand. I felt the tight knot in my chest that had been there for weeks start to loosen just a little bit. I filed all the case documents in a cardboard box and put it on the top shelf of my closet. Before I closed the box, I grabbed a sticky note and wrote, "Keep receipts. Keep calm," on it in black marker. I pressed the note onto the top of the box where I would see it if I ever needed to pull the documents out again. The box held everything from the CPS investigation, the court hearings, the police reports, and all the evidence we gathered to prove Catherine lied. I knew Yasmin and I had a long road ahead with therapy sessions and rebuilding our normal routines, but we were together again, and that was what mattered most right now. And that's today's lesson tucked inside the story. Hopefully you walk away with something useful, even if it's small. That's what makes it worth sharing. Subscribe if you'd like to keep learning with me.